My name is Margaret Calloway. I'm 68 years old, and last Thanksgiving, my daughter-in-law shoved me into the kitchen counter hard enough to fracture my wrist, while my son stood in the doorway and asked me to please just be reasonable. I drove myself to urgent care, had my wrist wrapped in a splint, and called my former colleague at the district attorney's office on the way home. Phase 1 was already complete. What none of them understood was that I had been a federal judge for 26 years. I had presided over fraud cases, asset forfeiture hearings, and elder financial abuse trials. I knew exactly how these things worked, and I had known for 4 months that my son and his wife were coming for everything Harold and I had spent 41 years building together. The whole thing started with a phone call on a Tuesday in late October. I was in the sunroom reading case law Old Habits when my son called. His voice had that particular quality I'd learned to recognize in defendants sitting across from me in the courtroom. The careful cheerfulness of someone who has already decided what they're going to do and is only now performing the courtesy of telling you. He said he and his wife wanted to come for Thanksgiving. He said it would be good for all of us to spend time together as a family. He said his wife's parents, who had recently moved up from Georgia, would love to meet me properly. I told him I'd make Harold's cornbread stuffing recipe, the one that took 2 days if you did it right. He said, "Great, Mom, that's great," and hung up before I could ask whether they'd be staying the night. I sat there in the sunroom for a moment, watching the last of the October light fall across the garden, where Harold's hydrangeas were going dormant for the winter. Then I picked up my phone and called Raymond. Raymond had worked for me as a law clerk 20 years ago. Now he ran his own estate planning practice and was one of the 2 or 3 people in the world I trusted completely. I told him about the phone call. He didn't say anything for a moment. He asked if I wanted him to send someone to sweep the house for anything unusual. I told him I'd already had that done in September. I asked him whether the Calloway family trust documentation was airtight. He said it was more than airtight. It was the most ironclad, irrevocable trust he'd drafted in 15 years of practice. I said good. I told him what I was planning. He was quiet again. Longer this time. He finally asked if I was sure I wanted to do it this way. I told him I needed to be certain. I needed them to show me clearly, on the record, in front of witnesses, exactly who they were. He said he understood. He'd been my law clerk long enough to know that I didn't move until I had every piece of evidence I needed. What he didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was what I'd done 3 months earlier. In August, I had paid off my son's business debt. All of it. $412,000, the full amount he owed to a private lender who had been sending increasingly unfriendly letters to an address my son didn't know I had access to. I'd done it anonymously, through a third-party LLC that couldn't be traced back to me. I had cleared his slate completely, given him a clean start, and then I had waited to see what kind of man he would be with that second chance. He had chosen this. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to understanding everything that came after. My son is not a stupid man. He graduated top of his class at Purdue. He ran a successful logistics company for 11 years before he met his wife, and the business started hemorrhaging money in ways that never quite made sense on paper. I'd had a forensic accountant review 3 years of financials before I ever said a word about it to anyone. The accountant found what I suspected. The money hadn't just disappeared. It had moved. His wife's family ran a small construction company out of Savannah, the kind of company that does a lot of subcontracting work, the kind of paperwork that's easy to manipulate if you know what you're doing and believe that the people around you are too distracted to notice. I noticed. I'd spent 26 years noticing things that other people missed. I spent the 2 weeks before Thanksgiving doing exactly what a 6-8-year-old widow was supposed to do. I went to the grocery store 3 times. I ordered a new tablecloth online. I called my son's wife to ask whether her parents had any dietary restrictions, and she said no. In that bright, particular way she had, that meant she was already somewhere else in her mind. I polished the silver that Harold and I had received as a wedding gift. I moved his reading chair 2 feet to the left, so there would be room for extra seating in the living room. I also checked the 4 pinhole cameras I'd had installed by a security firm in September. They were positioned in the living room, the dining room, the kitchen, and the hallway outside my home office. The audio was live and recording to an encrypted server. The feed was accessible from an app on my phone that was disguised to look like a weather application. On the morning of Thanksgiving, I woke at 5. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, with Harold's old cardigan around my shoulders. He'd been gone for 4 years. 4 years. And I still reached for him in the mornings without thinking. Still turned to say something to him when I read something in the newspaper that would have made him laugh. The grief doesn't go away. It just becomes part of the furniture of your life. You learn to move around it. I talked to him while I cooked. That's something I started doing in the first year after he passed and never stopped. I told him what was coming. I told him I was scared. Not of them, but of what I was about to learn. I was scared that the thing I'd suspected for the last year was actually true. That the boy we'd raised, the one who used to fall asleep on Harold's chest during football games when he was 4 years old, had become someone we wouldn't recognize. By 2 in the afternoon, the turkey was in the oven, and I'd changed into the dark green dress I wore to important things. I checked the camera feeds one last time. 6 green lights. Everything recording. I slipped my personal audio recorder into the pocket of my cardigan. Raymond had given it to me years ago, during a particularly complicated case. For emergencies, he'd said. Today qualified. They arrived at 4, which was 45 minutes earlier than I'd asked them to come. I noticed that early arrivals are either eager or anxious, sometimes both. My son looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, at Easter. When he'd seemed distracted and kept checking his phone under the table, his wife came in behind him wearing a silk blouse I recognized as expensive, and an expression I recognized as calculated warmth. Behind her came her parents. Her father was a broad man with a silver belt buckle and the handshake of someone who'd spent a lifetime trying to impress people. Her mother had careful eyes that moved around my living room the way a property assessor's eyes move, taking inventory. Her brother came in last. He was younger than his sister by several years, with the particular ease of a man who had never had to earn his own confidence. He introduced himself to me with my first name, which I hadn't offered. I noted that. I brought out appetizers. I poured wine. I asked about their drive and listened to the answers with the full attention of a woman who had spent decades listening to what people chose not to say. My son's wife mentioned twice that the house was beautiful. Her mother mentioned once that it must be a lot to maintain on my own. Her brother asked whether the neighborhood had changed much in recent years, which was a specific kind of question that meant something specific. At dinner, the conversation moved the way I expected it to. Her father talked about real estate values in the region. Her mother talked about how important it was for families to stay close, especially as people got older and circumstances changed. My son's wife talked about a friend of hers whose mother had moved into an assisted living community and how it had been such a positive experience. Such a relief for the whole family, really. I watched my son during all of this. He ate quietly. He didn't look at me directly. When I asked him a question, he answered it carefully, like a man who had rehearsed his lines, but wasn't certain he remembered them all correctly. I had cleared the main course and brought out the pie when my son's wife put her hands flat on the table and said that they actually needed to talk to me about something important. I set down the pie server. I folded my hands in my lap. I waited. She said that they were all very worried about me. She said that living alone in a house this size wasn't practical or safe for a woman my age. She said that she and my son had talked about it at length, and so had her parents. And they all agreed that the right thing to do was for her parents to move into the upstairs guest suite, just temporarily while they got settled, and then once that was sorted out, she and my son would move into the master bedroom, so that there was always someone in the house with me. I let the silence sit for a moment. I said, "The whole family?" She said yes. She said it with the particular confidence of someone who has been planning this conversation for a long time and believes it is already over. I asked what would happen to my home office, where I kept 40 years of case files, Harold's papers, and the desk where he used to grade his students' essays on Saturday mornings. Her brother said that rooms could be repurposed. He said it pleasantly, the way you say something you don't expect to be challenged on. I asked my son whether this was what he wanted. He looked at the tablecloth. He said he thought it made sense, given everything. He said he just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I said, given what? Exactly, my son's wife said. Given your age? Margaret. Given that you're alone. Given that this house is worth nearly $2 million and you're rattling around in it by yourself when it could be supporting the whole family? There it was, the word I'd been waiting for. Supporting. I told them I appreciated their concern. I told them the answer was no. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when someone has said the thing that breaks the performance. My son's wife said, "Excuse me?" I said the answer was no. This was my home. It was Harold's home. Her parents were not moving in. She and my son were not moving into the master bedroom. No one was repurposing my office. The answer was no. Her father pushed back from the table slightly. He said that was a very selfish position for me to take. My son said, "Mom, please." He said it quietly, desperately, like a man watching something he's built starting to collapse. His wife said that I clearly didn't understand the situation. She said that my son had been carrying serious financial stress for over a year and that I, as his mother, had an obligation to help him. She said families supported each other. She said that was what the house was for. That was what any of it was for. I said I understood the situation quite well. I said I had understood it for a long time. Something shifted in her face, a slight tightening. The recalculation of someone who has just realized the ground beneath them is not what they thought it was. I stood up from the table. I told them dinner was over and I needed them to leave. My son shot to his feet. He said I was being unreasonable. He said I always did this, made everything about what I wanted, never considered anyone else. He said his father would be ashamed of me. That landed the way he intended it to. Harold's name in my son's mouth, weaponized. I stood very still and let it land. And then I moved toward the kitchen to give myself a moment and to get away from the table before I said something I hadn't planned to say. I never made it to the other side of the kitchen island. His wife came around the table faster than I expected. She said I didn't get to just walk away from this conversation. She said her parents had given up their apartment in Savannah. She said they had nowhere else to go because my son had promised them this was settled. I told her calmly that her parents' housing situation was not my responsibility. She grabbed my arm. I pulled back. She stepped forward and shoved me, both hands flat against my shoulders, and I went back hard into the edge of the kitchen counter. My right wrist took the impact first. I heard it before I felt it, a sound like a green branch bending past the point of return. The pain came a moment later, sharp and white, traveling up my arm to my shoulder. The kitchen went completely still. My son made a sound I'd never heard him make before, something between a word and a breath. His wife stepped back. Her face had changed entirely. The performance was over because she had just done something that couldn't be undone. I straightened up slowly. I held my wrist against my chest. The pain was significant, but manageable. I had managed worse. I looked at my son. He was standing where he'd been standing the whole time. Next to the table, his hands open at his sides, doing nothing, saying nothing, just looking at me with an expression I could only describe as horror at his own inaction. I looked at his wife. She was already reconfiguring. I could see it happening in real time, the way she was pulling her face back into something resembling distress, shaping a narrative. I told her, very quietly, "Thank you." I told her she had just made everything considerably easier. I went to the front closet and got my coat and my purse. My son followed me into the entryway. He said, "Mom, wait." He said it was an accident. He said she hadn't meant to. He said we could figure this out. I asked him, standing in my own front hallway with my wrist throbbing against my chest, whether he was going to drive me to urgent care. He looked at his wife, who had followed us to the doorway. He looked back at me. He said, "Can't you just put some ice on it?" I opened the front door. I drove to the urgent care center on Waverly Road. It took 11 minutes. I kept my speed at exactly the limit. I used my left hand on the steering wheel and held my right arm across my lap. At a red light, I called Raymond. He answered on the second ring. I told him phase 1 was complete. I told him I had a fractured wrist and I needed him to meet me at urgent care and bring the documents. He said he was already in his car. The intake nurse at urgent care was a young man named David, according to his badge, who took one look at me holding my arm and stood up from his desk. I told him my name. I told him my date of birth. I told him that I had been physically assaulted by my daughter-in-law at my home address approximately 15 minutes ago, and that before anyone touched my wrist, I needed photographs taken. I needed my arrival time documented precisely. I needed my statement included verbatim in my intake record. I needed the urgent care physician notified that this was an assault case. He stared at me for a moment. Then, he picked up his phone. They took me to an examination room, and a physician came in. She was in her 40s, efficient, with the particular patience of someone who had learned not to be surprised by anything. I told her what I told the nurse. She nodded and asked a colleague to bring in the clinic's documentation camera before she examined me. They photographed my wrist from 4 angles. They photographed the beginning of bruising on my shoulder where the counter had made contact. They noted the time and my statement in the official record. The X-ray showed a hairline fracture of the distal radius. She said it was relatively clean and recommended a splint rather than casting, but that I needed to follow up with an orthopedic specialist within the week. I said I understood. I asked her for a complete copy of my medical record from this visit, including the photographs, the X-ray findings, and my intake statement. I told her I would be paying out of pocket, not through insurance, and I needed a detailed itemized receipt. She looked at me with an expression that I recognized. It was the expression people have when they are dealing with someone who knows exactly what they're doing and why. Raymond arrived while they were fitting the splint. He came into the examination room with his briefcase and looked at my wrist and then at my face for a long moment before he said anything. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine. He sat down in the chair beside the examination table and opened his briefcase without another word. 2 police officers arrived 20 minutes later. The clinic had reported the injury. A woman in her late 30s named Officer Chen came into the examination room first. With a notebook and careful eyes, I gave her my statement the same way. I'd given 1,000 depositions over the course of my career. Precise, sequential, unemotional, complete. I told her my daughter-in-law's name. I told her the address. I told her the exact sequence of events. I told her I had 4 cameras running in the house during the incident. Officer Chen looked up from her notebook. I said the footage was recording to a cloud server and I could pull it up on my phone immediately if she wanted to see it. I opened the weather application. I scrolled to the kitchen feed. I found the timestamp and pressed play. Officer Chen watched 38 seconds of footage. Then she said, "Ma'am, would you like to press charges?" I had planned to say yes immediately, but I had also planned, in the hours and days before this, for the possibility that I would need to leave them in the house for a little while longer, to let them believe they were still in control of the situation, to let them make the additional mistakes that would complete the picture. I put my face in my hands. I let my voice shake. I said I didn't know. I said she was my son's wife. I said I couldn't do that to my son. I said I had nowhere else to go if they were angry with me. I said maybe it had been an accident. I said I was confused. I said I was very tired. Raymond, sitting beside me, understood immediately. He told the officers that I was in shock, which was technically true, and that he would be handling all of my communications going forward, and that I would be staying with him that evening at an undisclosed location for my own safety. He thanked them for their response and gave them his card. Officer Chen handed me a pamphlet on domestic violence resources. She said to please reconsider. She said people who did things like this did not stop. I thanked her in a small, frightened voice. I took the pamphlet with trembling hands. The moment the door closed behind them, I stopped trembling. Raymond said, "How long do you want to give them?" I said, 2 hours should be sufficient. We drove to Raymond's office, which was 15 minutes from the urgent care center, and had a small conference room with a monitor that could display multiple feeds. Raymond poured himself coffee. I declined and sat down in front of the screen. They had started immediately. My son's wife was moving through the house the way I'd watched people move through crime scenes, purposeful and efficient, touching things and assessing them. She told her brother to go through the home office. She told her mother to start in the master bedroom. She told my son to find the wall safe. I watched my son's face on the camera feed. He knew where the safe was because I had shown him when he was 23, when Harold and I had updated our wills and explained to him how to access our documents in an emergency. He'd remembered. He went directly to it. My daughter-in-law's brother went into my office and started pulling files. He didn't know what he was looking at. He started stacking folders on the desk and photographing pages with his phone. He was photographing 40 years of case notes that I had already transferred to secure digital storage and that contained nothing of any current value. Her mother found Harold's watches in the drawer of his nightstand. She held them up to the light. She put 2 of them in her coat pocket. That was the moment I'd needed. I watched my son enter the safe combination. He got it right on the second try. The safe contained a manila envelope, a small amount of cash, and a handwritten note from me that said simply, "I know." I watched him read the note. I watched the color leave his face. I watched him show it to his wife. I said to Raymond, "All right, let's go." Raymond called the non-emergency police line and told them there was a break-in in progress at my address, that the parties involved had a key but had entered without permission after being asked to leave the premises, and that items had already been taken from the property. He gave them his name and my address and said we were en route. We pulled up to my house at the same time as the patrol car. Officer Chen was in it. I thought that was appropriate. Raymond rang the doorbell. My son opened the door. The look on his face when he saw me was the look I had been dreading and expecting in equal measure for 4 months. The look that meant the story he had been telling himself had just been replaced by a different, much worse story. I walked past him into my own home. His wife was in the living room. Her brother was standing near the office doorway. Her parents were coming down the stairs. Her mother still had Harold's watches in her coat pocket. Officer Chen noted this immediately. I stood in the center of my living room, with my splinted wrist and my good posture, and I looked at all of them. I said, "I'd like you all to meet Raymond Okafor. He's been my attorney for 18 years, and I believe you already know Officer Chen." Her mother tried to say something about a misunderstanding. Raymond opened his briefcase. Officer Chen pointed at her coat pocket and asked if she would mind emptying it. My daughter-in-law looked at me with an expression I recognized. I had seen it across the bench many times. It was the expression of someone who has just understood, fully and finally, that the person they believed they were outmaneuvering was, in fact, the person setting the terms. My son said, "Mom." He just said it the one time, quietly. I looked at him. There was a long moment where neither of us said anything. I thought about Harold, about what he would have done in this moment, whether he would have been more forgiving than I was prepared to be. I thought about the fact that I had paid $412,000 to clear this man's debt, had wiped the record clean and handed him back his life. And he had used the gift to come and take mine. I said, "I know about the debt, son. I know it was paid in August. I know you know it was paid, because the lender sent confirmation to the same email address your father set up for you in college that you think no one else knows the password to. I paid it. I cleared it. I gave you a free start. I waited to see what you would do with it." He stood completely still. I said, "I needed to know what kind of man you were going to be. And now I know." Officer Chen made the arrests efficiently and without drama. My daughter-in-law was charged with assault and battery and theft. Her brother was charged with theft and trespassing. Her parents were charged with theft. My son was charged with criminal trespass and conspiracy. While Chen's partner was reading my son his rights, Raymond spread the trust documents on the dining room table. I explained, for the benefit of everyone present, that this house and all associated assets had been held in the Harold and Margaret Calloway Family Trust for the past 6 years, that the trust was irrevocable, that no assets could be transferred, sold, or otherwise disposed of without trustee approval, that the trustees were Raymond Okafor and me, that my son was not a trustee, and had no claim to the trust assets during my lifetime or after. My daughter-in-law said, from where Officer Chen was holding her arm, that I couldn't do that children had rights, that she would get a lawyer and fight this. Raymond said she was welcome to try. He said the trust had been reviewed and validated by 3 separate estate attorneys and a circuit court judge, and that she would be fighting it from inside a courtroom where she was also facing felony assault charges. She had nothing to say to that. They were taken outside. I stood in my living room and listened to the sound of the patrol car pulling away, and then there was quiet. Raymond stayed for another hour. He helped me call my orthopedic specialist's after-hours line to arrange a follow-up appointment. He helped me confirm that the camera footage had been preserved and copied to 3 separate secure locations. He asked twice whether I wanted him to call anyone to stay with me. I told him I was fine. I told him to go home to his family. After he left, I walked through my house slowly, room by room, turning on lights. In the office, I straightened the folders my daughter-in-law's brother had disturbed. In the master bedroom, I picked up the photograph of Harold that her mother had knocked off the nightstand in her search. It was Harold and me at our 41st anniversary dinner, 4 months before the diagnosis. We were both laughing at something the photographer had said. He had his arm around my shoulders, and I had my head tipped toward him, and we looked, I thought, like 2 people who had no idea how much time they actually had left together. I set it back in its place. I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself be quiet for a while. I had known this day was coming for 4 months, and I had planned for it carefully, and it had gone almost exactly as I'd expected it to go. That was the strange thing about having spent a career in the law. You got very good at predicting the thing you most hoped would not be true. I had hoped my son would surprise me. I had paid his debt and waited and hoped. He had not surprised me. I cried for a while, sitting there on the edge of the bed, with Harold's photograph on the nightstand. Not dramatically, not the way people cry in movies, just quietly, the way you cry when something is truly over, and you've known it was over for a long time, and the knowing of it doesn't make it any less sad. I told Harold I was sorry. I told him I'd done everything I could think of to give our son another chance. I told him I didn't know whether he would have done it the same way, or whether he would have found something in him that I couldn't find. I told him I missed him every day, and that I was going to be all right. The charges worked their way through the system over the following months. My daughter-in-law's assault charge was prosecuted. She accepted a plea arrangement that included restitution and probation. Her parents' theft charges resulted in fines and community service. Her brother took a plea on the trespass and theft. My son was offered a diversion program given his lack of prior record, which required regular check-ins and a period of supervised release. He wrote me a letter 6 weeks after the arrest, 3 pages, handwritten. He said he had been in a kind of fog for the past 2 years, that he had known something was wrong with the direction his life was taking and had not had the courage to stop it. He said he understood now that I had given him an enormous gift in August. Not just the money, but the chance to be different, and that he had wasted it. He said he was sorry. He said he was in therapy. He said he didn't expect anything from me in return. I read the letter 3 times. I put it in the drawer of Harold's nightstand, next to the book of poems he'd kept there and never finished. I didn't write back. Not yet. In the spring, Raymond called to tell me that the Callaway Community Trust, which was the secondary funding vehicle Harold and I had established alongside the family trust, had approved its first full cycle of grants. A nursing student named Patricia received a scholarship that would cover her remaining 2 years of school. She sent me a card with a photograph of herself at her clinical rotation, wearing scrubs and looking pleased with herself in the way of someone who has worked hard for something they actually wanted. A literacy program in our county received funding for after-school tutoring for 32 children. A grief counseling center that Harold had believed in was able to hire 2 additional counselors. Harold had wanted his life to mean something useful. He had spent 40 years teaching high school history because he believed that the specific combination of knowing where you come from and learning to think critically was the most practical form of hope a person could offer another. 18 personnes. When he got sick, he sat at his desk in this house and wrote out, in his careful teacher's handwriting, everything he wanted to happen after he was gone. Not for himself, for the people who might need what he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. I thought about that a lot. In the months after Thanksgiving, about what we build and who it's for, about the difference between what we owe the people we love and what we owe the people we hope they'll become. On what would have been our 46th anniversary, I sat in the garden in the early morning with coffee and Harold's old cardigan and watched the hydrangeas he'd planted the first summer we owned this house, coming back to life after the winter. They were enormous now. They spread across the back fence in great arching branches that looked in early bloom like something he would have wanted to photograph. I told him about the nursing student. I told him about the literacy program. I told him the grief counseling center had named a room after us, which he would have found embarrassing, and I found quietly moving. I told him that Raymond had started referring to the trust as Harold's house, not to my face. But I'd overheard him say it on the phone, and I thought Harold would have liked that. I told him about our son. I said I didn't know yet whether there was a version of this that ended with some kind of reconciliation. I said I thought it was possible. I said that the boy who used to fall asleep on Harold's chest during football games was still somewhere inside the man who had stood in my kitchen and watched his wife push me into a counter. That the two things were both true, and I hadn't figured out yet how to hold them at the same time. I said I wasn't ready. I said maybe someday. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. A bird moved through the hydrangeas. The morning light was doing what morning light does in May when the season has finally committed to itself. I finished my coffee. I went inside and made breakfast. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they have been filled up with enough living that the quiet itself has a particular quality. Not empty, but resting. I was exactly where I was supposed to be.